Unearthing, Rome's lost city. Ostia Antica. The road from Rome to Ostia is short, almost disappointingly so. Barely 30 kilometers separate the imperial capital from the sea, and today the journey passes through suburbs, railway lines, and modern sprawl. There is no dramatic climb, no sense of departure from civilization. And yet, as the road narrows and the ruins begin to emerge from the pine trees, something quietly unsettling happens. Rome feels suddenly absent, not destroyed, not diminished, simply irrelevant. Ostia Antica does not announce itself with grandeur. There is no colossal arch like the Colosseum, no marble forum dominating the horizon. Instead, there is a gate, Porta Romana, low, practical, almost modest. Passing through it feels less like entering a monument and more like stepping sideways in time. The air changes first. It carries the scent of earth and stone rather than traffic. Cicadas hum where engines once roared. The ground beneath your feet is not polished marble, but worn basalt, grooved by centuries of cartwheels. These are not ceremonial roads. These are working streets. And that is Ostia's quiet provocation. This city was not built to impress emperors, it was built to function. For centuries, Ostia was Rome's mouth, its port, its warehouse, its lungs. Nearly every grain shipment that fed the million mouths of imperial Rome passed through here. Every amphora of olive oil, every crate of marble, every sack of spices from the eastern Mediterranean touched Ostian soil before it reached the capital. Yet Ostia is rarely the city people imagine when they think of ancient Rome. It had no emperor's palaces, no triumphal processions, no senate debating the fate of provinces. What it had instead were dockworkers, merchants, shopkeepers, innkeepers, slaves, freedmen, women running businesses, families living in apartments, and migrants speaking dozens of languages. Ostia was Rome's reality. And perhaps that is why it has been so easy to overlook. The ruins stretch outward slowly as you walk. Not upward like Rome's monuments, but laterally, block after block, revealing an entire urban organism frozen in mid-motion. Streets intersect at right angles, apartment buildings rise 3 and 4 stories high, shops still open onto the street, their counters intact. Latrines sit beside taverns, shrines nestle into street corners. This is not a city reduced to fragments. This is a city paused. What makes Ostia Antica extraordinary, what sets it apart from Pompeii, Herculaneum, or the Roman Forum, is not a single catastrophic moment of preservation. There was no volcanic ash here, no sudden entombment. Ostia survived through abandonment. As the Tiber's course shifted and the coastline moved outward, the port silted up. Commerce drifted north to Portus. Slowly, quietly, Ostia emptied. Its buildings collapsed gradually, roofs falling in, upper floors eroding, but the lower levels remained, sealed by time rather than disaster. This slow retreat preserved something rare, not spectacle, but structure. Here you can follow the rhythm of an ordinary day in an extraordinary civilization. You can trace how goods moved from ship to warehouse, from warehouse to shop, from shop to table. You can see where people bathed, argued, prayed, and ate, slept, and worked. You can stand inside their apartments and understand, viscerally, what it meant to live in a Roman city that was neither elite nor marginal, but essential. This is a city built for movement. From the Decumanus Maximus, the main east-west artery, you can still see wheel ruts etched deep into the stone. These are not decorative scars. They are the record of relentless traffic. Carts laden with grain, barrels of wine, stone blocks, timber, animals, people. Imagine the noise, iron-rimmed wheels scraping stone, vendors shouting prices, dock workers calling instructions in Greek, Latin, Punic, and Egyptian dialects, the smell of fish sauce, sweat, damp wood, and grain dust hanging in the air, the cries of animals bound for slaughter, the clang of metal tools, the constant background murmur of a city that never fully slept. Rome may have commanded the empire, but Ostia made that command possible. And yet, for all its importance, Ostia was never meant to be remembered. Its residents were not writing epic histories. They were keeping accounts, signing contracts, negotiating shipments, feeding a city that consumed resources on a scale the ancient world had never seen before. This is why Ostia matters, because it reveals Rome not as an idea, but as a system dependent on logistics, labor, and coordination, a system that functioned only because cities like Ostia existed, humming quietly in the background, absorbing the chaos of empire so the capital could appear eternal. As the sun rises higher and shadows retreat from the colonnades, Ostia begins to feel less like ruins and more like a city waiting for its inhabitants to return. And that is the unsettling brilliance of this place. You are not looking at the past as spectacle. You are standing inside a day that once repeated itself thousands of times, ordinary, exhausting, necessary. To understand Rome, we must begin here, at the port, at the warehouses, at the dawn of another working day. Morning in Ostia did not begin with silence. It began with movement. Long before the sun fully cleared the horizon, the city was already awake, not in the leisurely sense of aristocratic Rome, but in the urgent, practical rhythm of a place built to serve others. Ostia was not a city that eased into the day. It surged forward, driven by tides, schedules, and the unforgiving demands of supply. The river came first, the Tiber, broader here than in Rome, carried ships upstream from the sea, their hulls heavy with grain from Egypt, olive oil from Baetica, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, and exotic luxuries from farther east. These vessels were not graceful. They were blunt, wide-bellied workhorses, designed for capacity rather than elegance. As they docked, the air filled with sound. Ropes slapped against wood. Orders were shouted across decks. Dock workers, many enslaved, many free, all skilled, moved with practiced efficiency. Cargo was not unloaded casually. Every sack, every amphora, every crate was counted, recorded, inspected. Mistakes here did not mean inconvenience. They meant hunger in Rome. This was the first truth of Ostia's mornings. The city fed an empire. From the docks, goods moved immediately inland toward the Horea, the massive warehouses that still dominate Ostia's ruins today. Walking among them now, their brick walls rising in orderly repetition, it is easy to underestimate their importance. They look austere, almost dull. In antiquity, they were lifelines. Some stored grain, stacked high in sacks that had to be kept dry, ventilated, protected from pests. Others held oil in tall amphorae sealed with pitch, wine aging in cool darkness, or building materials awaiting transport. These were not generic storage spaces. Each warehouse was specialized, regulated, and often tied to specific trade guilds. The most revealing space in Ostia lies just beyond these warehouses, the Piazzale delle Corporazioni. Today it appears quiet, a large open square surrounded by small rooms, with black and white mosaics embedded in the ground. But in the morning hours of the Roman world, this piazza would have been alive with negotiation. Each mosaic tells a story. A ship with billowing sails marks the guild of shipowners. An elephant advertises traders connected to Africa. Grain measures, dolphins, anchors, and port cranes signal the presence of specialized corporations, organized bodies of merchants and transporters whose wealth and influence rivaled that of minor aristocrats. These were not casual associations. Guilds in Ostia controlled contracts, managed labor, negotiated with imperial officials, and ensured the steady flow of goods to Rome. Their members came from across the empire, Greek speakers from the Aegean, Syrians from the Levant, North Africans, Italians born far from the capital. In Ostia, an identity was professional before it was civic. What mattered was not your lineage, but your role in the machine, and the machine was relentless. Grain shipments alone demanded staggering coordination. Egypt's annual harvest had to reach Rome before winter. Delays meant shortages. Shortages meant unrest. Unrest meant political danger. Emperors fell not because of invasions, but because bread ran out. Ostia absorbed this pressure daily. Accountants recorded quantities with obsessive precision. Weights and measures were standardized. Fraud was punished severely. The ruins preserve not just buildings, but evidence of bureaucracy, offices, counters, inscriptions detailing regulations and responsibilities. This was not a free market fantasy. It was a managed economy, one that blended private enterprise with imperial oversight. The state depended on merchants, but it also watched them closely. Ostia was where cooperation and coercion met, and it was not glamorous work. The people who made this system function rarely appear in statues or histories. Dock workers strained their bodies unloading cargo. Porters carried sacks weighing more than they did. Warehouse supervisors worried constantly about spoilage, theft, and fire. Fires were especially feared. Brick walls could not save grain once flames took hold. Morning was the most dangerous time. The city was crowded. Lamps still burned in enclosed spaces. Carts jammed the streets. One mistake could ripple outward into catastrophe. Yet the work continued. From the Horea, goods moved again onto smaller boats headed upriver to Rome, onto carts for redistribution, into shops and taverns that served Ostia's own population. This constant circulation meant the city never truly paused. There was no opening hour. Commerce was continuous, layered, overlapping, and this shaped the character of the city itself. Ostia's architecture reflects urgency. Buildings are practical, dense, stacked tightly against one another. Streets are narrow but efficient. Shops open directly onto sidewalks, blurring the boundary between private and public space. There is little wasted space here. Even beauty serves function. Mosaics advertise services. Inscriptions declare affiliations. Shrines to Mercury, god of commerce, appear at crossroads and warehouses, not out of abstract piety, but because trade was risky, and divine favor was another form of insurance. Standing in Ostia's morning light, one begins to understand how different this city was from the Rome of marble propaganda. Rome projected power. Ostia sustained it. Without Ostia, Rome was a starving giant, and without cities like Ostia across the empire, ports, mines, farms, workshops, the imperial center would have collapsed under its own appetite. This is why Ostia Antica matters so deeply. It shows us that empire was not built only by legions and laws, but by schedules, cargo manifests, labor contracts, and exhausted workers who never appeared on triumphal arches. By mid-morning, the docks would be fully alive, the piazzale buzzing, the warehouses sealed again after inspections. The day's economic spine would be in motion, and the city would turn, briefly, to something else, to politics, to bathing, to eating, to living. By midday, the tempo of Ostia changed. The frantic urgency of the morning, the race to unload ships, secure contracts, and move goods inland began to soften. The sun climbed higher, shadows shortened, and the city's energy shifted from pure labor to something more layered and human. This was the hour when Ostia revealed itself not merely as an economic machine, but as a community. The heart of that community lay not in the warehouses or docks, but inland, where streets widened and buildings opened into public space. Here stood Ostia's Forum, not monumental in the way Rome's was, but functional, accessible, and deeply integrated into daily life. The Forum was not a place one visited ceremonially. It was a place one passed through. Merchants crossed it on their way to offices. Magistrates conducted business beneath colonnades. Citizens gathered in small clusters, exchanging news, complaints, rumors. Notices were posted on walls, announcements of auctions, legal decisions, upcoming events. Politics in Ostia was practical, not theatrical. Decisions here affected water supply, market regulation, sanitation, and building maintenance. The city's officials were less concerned with glory than with preventing disruption. Ostia's success depended on stability, and stability required visibility. Anyone could walk through the Forum and see authority at work. Magistrates sat in open view. Disputes were aired publicly. Contracts were witnessed. Ostia was a city where governance happened in daylight because secrecy bred suspicion, and suspicion threatened commerce. From the Forum, the city spilled outward into a network of public amenities that defined Roman urban life. And chief among them were the baths. The bath complexes of Ostia remain some of its most evocative ruins. Their walls still rise impressively high. Their floors still shimmer with mosaics depicting athletes, sea creatures, and mythological figures. But to understand their importance, one must forget modern ideas of bathing as private hygiene. The baths were Ostia's social engines. Here, citizens of vastly different backgrounds encountered one another, naked, unarmed, and, at least temporarily, equalized. Dock workers soaked aching muscles beside merchants. Freedmen shared steam rooms with minor officials. News traveled faster through the baths than through any formal channel. Business was conducted here. Connections were forged, reputations were made, or quietly damaged. Bathing followed a ritual rhythm. Exercise in the palaestra, sweating in heated rooms, immersion in cold pools, relaxation in warm chambers. This was not indulgence alone. It was maintenance of bodies worn down by labor and of relationships essential to Ostia's functioning. And the baths were not silent spaces. They echoed with conversation, laughter, argument. Voices bounced off tiled walls. The scent of oil, steam, and stone filled the air. This was where the city breathed. Outside the baths, the streets were lined with establishments that catered to constant movement. Taverns, bakeries, and thermopolia, the ancient equivalent of fast food counters, punctuated nearly every block. Ostia did not dine privately the way Rome's elite did. It ate collectively. Counters built into shop fronts still hold the circular openings where jars once sat, filled with hot food, stews, lentils, vegetables, wine. Most Ostians lived in apartments without full kitchens. Cooking was inefficient, dangerous, and expensive. Eating out was not luxury, it was necessity. These eateries were noisy, crowded, informal. People stood, talked, ate quickly. Conversations overlapped. Arguments flared and faded. Laughter cut through the din. Food was fuel, but it was also social glue. This was where gossip spread, where laborers complained about supervisors, where sailors shared stories from distant ports, where locals met newcomers and assessed their intentions. Ostia was a city constantly absorbing outsiders, and these spaces were where integration happened. Yet beneath this vibrancy lay tension. Ostia's population was transient. Many residents stayed only a few seasons. Wealth moved through the city, but did not always remain. Inequality was visible everywhere, between those who owned warehouses and those who carried their contents, between free citizens and enslaved workers, between locals and foreigners. Public life blurred these distinctions, but it did not erase them. The forum and baths brought people together, but they also made hierarchy visible. Clothing, speech, companions, all signaled status subtly. Roman society thrived on such signals, and Ostia was no exception. Religion, too, threaded through public space. Shrines stood at crossroads. Small temples nestled between shops. Cults dedicated to Isis, Mithras, Hercules, and countless other deities coexisted comfortably. Ostia's gods reflected its population, maritime, multicultural, pragmatic. Faith here was transactional as much as devotional. Offerings were made for safe voyages, unprofitable deals, healthy children, protection from fire and flood. Religious life did not withdraw from commerce, it sanctified it. By midday, the city had reached a kind of equilibrium. Goods were moving smoothly, disputes had been aired, bodies were cleaned and relaxed, meals had been taken. The worst heat of the day encouraged a slower pace, a brief pause before activity resumed. Standing in Ostia at this hour, one can feel the extraordinary ordinariness of it all. This was not a city of emperors or philosophers shaping the destiny of the world. It was a city of people managing complexity, negotiating, adapting, maintaining fragile balances day after day. And in that sense, Ostia may be the most honest Roman city we possess. It shows us what empire looked like when stripped of marble propaganda and heroic narrative. It shows Rome not as an idea, but as a lived system, one that depended on cooperation as much as coercion, on routine as much as spectacle. As the sun began its slow descent, shadows lengthened again across the streets. The city did not fall silent, but its energy turned inward, from public spaces to private ones, from commerce to domestic life, from noise to routine. The afternoon belonged to the home. As the afternoon heat settled over Ostia, the city drew inward. The streets did not empty. Ostia never truly emptied, but their rhythm softened. The urgency of commerce gave way to the quieter persistence of domestic life, the routines that sustained families long after ships had been unloaded and contracts signed. To understand Ostia in the afternoon is to leave the public spaces and step inside its buildings. And what immediately becomes clear is that this was a city of apartments. Unlike Rome's aristocratic hills dotted with expansive domus, Ostia was dominated by insulae, multi-story apartment blocks built of brick and concrete, rising 3, 4, sometimes even 5 stories high. These structures still stand today in astonishing condition, their staircases intact, their walls bearing traces of plaster and paint. They tell a story of density. Ostia housed tens of thousands of people within a limited footprint, many of them migrants drawn by opportunity or necessity. Space was precious. Privacy was relative. Daily life unfolded in close proximity to strangers. Apartments varied widely in quality. Lower floors, closer to street level and water access, were more desirable and more expensive. Upper floors were cheaper, hotter, and riskier. Fire was a constant threat. Structural collapse was not uncommon. Those who lived higher lived with more danger. Yet even the humblest apartments reveal care. Small shrines tucked into corners, niches for oil lamps, traces of wall decoration, reds, yellows, blues, suggesting an effort to impose beauty on confinement. People made homes where they could. Inside these apartments, afternoons were for maintenance. Clothing was mended, tools were repaired. Children were supervised. Meals were prepared if the household had access to a hearth, or planned around the nearest thermopolium if it did not. Water was carried from public fountains. Waste was managed carefully, or sometimes not carefully enough. Ostia's infrastructure was impressive by ancient standards, but it had limits. Public latrines existed, often communal and surprisingly sophisticated, with flowing water and stone seating, but access varied by neighborhood. Many relied on chamber pots emptied into drains or streets. Sanitation was functional, not hygienic in the modern sense. Disease was an ever-present reality. Parasites, respiratory infections, gastrointestinal illnesses, these were part of daily life. Medical knowledge existed, but treatment was inconsistent and often expensive. Physicians practiced in Ostia, some highly skilled, others less so. The boundary between medicine and superstition was porous. Still, life continued. Families gathered in small rooms, eating, talking, arguing. Neighbors heard everything. Walls were thin. Privacy was negotiated, not assumed. Social life extended vertically as much as horizontally, up staircases, across balconies, and through shared courtyards. The architecture encouraged interaction. Many apartment blocks were built around central courtyards that brought light and air into the building. These spaces became informal social hubs. Children played. Adults exchanged news. Disputes were aired and resolved or escalated. This closeness fostered community, but also tension. Conflicts over noise, smells, water access, and shared responsibilities were inevitable. Legal texts from the Roman world suggest that such disputes were common, and Ostia's density would have amplified them. Yet the city functioned. This is perhaps the most striking aspect of Ostia's domestic life. Despite crowding, inequality, and constant strain, the city endured for centuries. Its residents adapted. They developed routines, expectations, informal rules that allowed coexistence. And domestic life in Ostia was not isolated from the economy, it was shaped by it. Many homes doubled as workplaces, shops occupied ground floors, with families living above. Artisans produced goods in cramped spaces, merchants stored inventory at home. The line between public and private was fluid. Children grew up surrounded by work. They learned trades by observation and participation. Formal education existed, but it was uneven. Literacy varied widely. Some children studied reading, writing, and arithmetic. Others entered labor early, contributing to household survival. Women's roles were similarly complex. While Roman ideology emphasized male authority, Ostia's evidence suggests women were economically active. Inscriptions record female business owners, patrons of guilds, managers of property. Domestic life did not confine women entirely to the private sphere. Still, inequality was real. Enslaved individuals lived and worked within these households, often sharing the same spaces but with radically different degrees of autonomy. Slavery in Ostia was not abstract. It was domestic, visible, embedded in daily routines. The afternoon hours were also when the city's vulnerabilities became most apparent. Heat exacerbated smells. Crowded living conditions amplified discomfort. Tempers frayed. Fires were most likely to break out during cooking or craft work. Flooding from the Tiber could affect lower levels unexpectedly. Ostia's residents lived with risk, and yet they persisted, not because life was easy, but because it was familiar. Walking through the ruins today, one can still trace these domestic rhythms, and doorways open onto stairwells worn smooth by centuries of feet. Thresholds are deeply grooved. Wall niches hint at household gods once honored daily. These are not the remains of grandeur. They are the remains of habit. and habit, more than ideology, sustained the Roman world. As the afternoon wore on, light shifted across facades, illuminating the city's vertical complexity. Shadows pooled in stairwells. The heat began to ease. People emerged again into the streets, not for work, but for something else, for entertainment, for ritual, for reflection. As day tilted toward evening, Ostia prepared to gather once more, not around contracts or chores, but around shared experience. The city's final act was about to begin. As evening settled over Ostia, the city exhaled. The heat that had pressed down on brick and stone throughout the afternoon began to loosen its grip. Shadows lengthened across the Decumanus Maximus, stretching from column to column, doorway to doorway. Lamps flickered to life in shops and homes, small points of light pushing back the approaching dusk. This was the hour when Ostia turned outward again. Not toward commerce, not toward labor, but toward shared experience. The most obvious destination was the theater. Built into the city's fabric rather than standing apart from it, Ostia's theater could hold several thousand spectators, an extraordinary capacity for a port city. Even today, sitting on its stone seats, one can see how deliberately it was placed. From the upper tiers, the view extends outward toward the city, reminding spectators that performance was not separate from daily life, but part of it. In the evening, people arrived in groups. Families climbed the steps together. Friends greeted one another loudly. Vendors moved through the crowd selling snacks and drinks. Performances here were not elite affairs. They were popular, noisy, and accessible. Comedy, music, recitations, and mime drew audiences from across the social spectrum. The theater was where Ostia momentarily became a single body. Differences of status did not disappear, but they blurred. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Shared reactions created fleeting unity. For a few hours, the pressures of work, inequality, and survival receded. Entertainment was not escapism alone. It was cohesion. Rome understood this well, and Ostia benefited from that understanding. A fed population might remain calm. A distracted one was even more manageable. But beyond political calculation, spectacle fulfilled a genuine human need to gather, to watch, to feel part of something larger. As darkness deepened, the city did not shut down. Taverns filled again. Wine flowed more freely now. Conversations grew louder, looser. Music spilled into the streets. Religious rituals took place under torchlight. Offerings made, prayers spoken for protection through the night. Yet even in these moments of communal warmth, Ostia carried within it the seeds of its own silence. The port that had given the city life was changing. Over centuries, the Tiber deposited silt relentlessly. The coastline crept outward. Ships found it harder to reach the docks. New harbors, most notably Portus, rose to replace Ostia's function. When trade routes shifted, at first the change was subtle. Warehouses were used less frequently. Some guilds relocated. Maintenance was deferred. Buildings were repaired less thoroughly. A city built on movement began to slow. Unlike Pompeii, Ostia did not die in an instant. It faded. Families moved away gradually. Apartments emptied floor by floor. Shops closed quietly. The theater saw fewer performances. Baths were maintained less often. Infrastructure degraded. And yet, for a long time, Ostia remained inhabited. Even as its central role diminished, people continued to live among its streets. The city adapted downward, shrinking in importance, but not in presence. This slow decline is precisely what preserved it. Without a catastrophic end, Ostia avoided wholesale destruction. Buildings collapsed inward rather than being stripped away. Roofs fell, upper floors eroded, but ground-level structures remained sealed beneath layers of debris and vegetation. Time became Ostia's archivist. Centuries passed. The medieval world rose and fell. Rome transformed again and again. Ostia slipped further into obscurity, its name remembered but its substance forgotten. Pine forests grew over its ruins. Farmers grazed animals among fallen walls. The city became a rumor. When systematic excavations began in the 19th and early 20th centuries, what emerged astonished scholars. Not isolated monuments, but an entire urban landscape. Streets, shops, homes, latrines, shrines, warehouses, preserved with an intimacy rarely seen in the ancient world. Ostia offered something Rome itself could not. Rome tells us how the empire wanted to be seen. Ostia tells us how it actually functioned. Walking through the city today, especially in the quiet of evening, one becomes acutely aware of absence. Not the dramatic absence of destruction, but the gentle absence of repetition. No footsteps echo on the stones, no carts grind past, no voices rise from the baths. And yet the city does not feel dead. It feels paused. This is Ostia's enduring power. It allows us to reconstruct not just events, but rhythms, not just structures, but routines. It shows us a Roman world beyond emperors and battles, a world of schedules, negotiations, fatigue, cooperation, and adaptation. A world where empire was sustained by ordinary people doing extraordinary amounts of work. As night fully descends, the ruins grow quiet. The last light fades from brick walls once painted bright. The city retreats into shadow as it has for centuries, but Ostia Antica is not a cautionary tale of decline. It is a reminder of complexity. Empires do not collapse only through invasion or catastrophe. They erode through shifts in geography, economics, and infrastructure. Cities rise and fall not because they are virtuous or corrupt, but because their purpose changes, and yet meaning endures. Ostia remains one of the clearest windows into ancient urban life ever uncovered. It allows us to step beyond imperial narratives and encounter Rome as a lived experience, crowded, pragmatic, resilient, flawed. To walk Ostia is to walk through a day that once repeated endlessly. Morning's labor, midday's conversation, afternoon's domestic routines, evenings shared spectacle. And then, slowly, over centuries, silence. In that silence, Ostia speaks, not of glory, but of life. A single day in Ostia can tell us much, but no city is truly understood in a day. To walk Ostia Antica in silence today is to forget that this place once pulsed not just with daily routines, but with seasons, cycles of anticipation, abundance, anxiety, and scarcity that shaped every life within its walls. The city changed with the year. In late summer, when grain ships arrived from Egypt, Ostia was tense. The harvest upriver had already been gathered. Rome waited. Delays meant unrest. Every arrival was watched closely. Dock workers worked longer hours. Warehouses filled rapidly. Officials inspected shipments with heightened scrutiny. This was the season of pressure. In winter, the city contracted. The sea grew unpredictable. Then fewer ships docked. Warehouses opened more slowly. Fires were more dangerous as residents relied on heat and light. Disease spread more easily in damp conditions. The rhythm of the streets softened, but anxiety lingered beneath the surface. Spring brought renewal and risk. The Tiber swelled with meltwater. Flooding threatened lower neighborhoods. Streets near the river became impassable. Repairs were constant. At the same time, trade routes reopened. Merchants returned. Construction resumed. The city inhaled again. Autumn was the season of reckoning, Accounts were balanced, profits tallied, losses absorbed. Families assessed whether the year had been good enough to survive the next. Ostia's architecture reflects these cycles. Drainage systems snake beneath streets, designed to handle seasonal flooding. Storehouses were built with raised floors. Doorways show signs of repeated repair. Nothing here was static. The city was constantly adapting to forces beyond its control. This is something imperial Rome often hides. Monuments suggest permanence. Ostia reveals contingency. The people of Ostia lived with uncertainty as a constant companion. Their city existed at the mercy of water, weather, politics, and distant harvests. They planned meticulously, but they could not control everything. And so their daily routines were shaped by preparedness. Families stored food when they could. Guilds maintained emergency funds. Shrines multiplied at moments of heightened risk. Religion intensified, not in times of leisure, but in times of uncertainty. A day in Ostia was never just a day. It was part of a longer calculation. This becomes especially clear when we consider childhood. Children in Ostia grew up surrounded by work, noise, and impermanence. Many did not survive infancy. Those who did learned early that the city demanded contribution. Play existed, but often alongside labor. Graffiti scratched into walls by small hands still survives. Simple drawings, names, games etched into stone. These are quiet reminders that Ostia was not only a city of commerce, but of growing lives. Education varied widely. Some children learned letters and numbers. Others learned trades. Knowledge was practical. Survival depended less on philosophy than on usefulness. And then there was aging. Old age in Ostia was not guaranteed. Those who reached it often relied on family, guilds, or religious associations. The city provided some support, but most care was private, negotiated within households and networks. Death was omnipresent. Funerary inscriptions found along Ostia's roads speak of short lives, sudden losses, and communal mourning. Cemeteries lined the approaches to the city, reminding every traveler that Ostia was a place of constant arrival and constant departure. Yet death did not halt the city. It was absorbed into its rhythm. Funerals passed through streets, life resumed, warehouses reopened, ships docked. Empire demanded continuity. This is the deeper truth Ostia reveals. Rome did not endure because it was glorious. It endured because cities like Ostia normalized uncertainty. They made instability manageable. As night fell each day, lamps were lit not in celebration, but in preparation for another cycle, another tide, another shipment, another risk. And so, when we return mentally to our single day in Ostia, the morning docks, the midday baths, the afternoon apartments, the evening theater, we must understand that each moment carried with it memory and expectation. Every resident knew yesterday mattered, and tomorrow mattered more. If commerce gave Ostia its purpose, religion gave it coherence. To walk through Ostia Antica today is to encounter shrines everywhere, at street corners, beside warehouses, embedded in apartment blocks, tucked into courtyards. They are small, often easily missed, and radically different from the grand temples that dominate Rome's skyline. That difference matters. Ostia's religious life was not centralized, monumental, or uniform. It was distributed, intimate, and deeply pragmatic. Faith here was not about imperial ideology or theological purity. It was about safety, identity, and belonging in a city defined by movement. Ostia was one of the most diverse cities in the Roman world. Its population shifted constantly. Sailors arrived and departed. Merchants stayed for seasons or years. Freedmen relocated permanently. Slaves were brought from every corner of the empire. Languages overlapped, customs collided, family origins stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. Religion was how this diversity became manageable. Each community brought its gods with it. Isis, the Egyptian goddess of protection and rebirth, had a strong presence in Ostia. Her cult appealed especially to sailors and merchants, people whose lives depended on forces they could not control. Initiates sought not only divine favor, but community, shared rituals, mutual support, and a sense of continuity in an uncertain world. Mithras, whose cult flourished among soldiers and officials, offered something different. His shrines, the Mithraea, were hidden underground, cave-like spaces that emphasized secrecy, hierarchy, and initiation. In a city where status was often ambiguous, Mithraism offered clear structure and belonging. Traditional Roman gods were present too: Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mercury. Mercury, god of trade and travel, was especially prominent. Shrines to him stood near warehouses and crossroads, reminders that commerce itself was a sacred activity. But Ostia did not enforce exclusivity. People participated in multiple cults. Religious identity was additive, not competitive. One could honor local household gods in the morning, make an offering to Isis before a voyage, and attend a festival for Jupiter without contradiction. This pluralism was not tolerance in a modern sense. It was pragmatism. The city could not function if belief became divisive. Too many livelihoods depended on cooperation across cultural lines. Religion had to bind, not fracture. This binding function becomes clear when we look at religious associations. Many cults doubled as social networks. Members paid dues, they gathered for meals, they buried their dead. In a city where family ties were often distant or absent, these associations provided stability. They also offered dignity. For freedmen and enslaved individuals, religious communities could provide recognition denied elsewhere. Titles within cults carried prestige. Ritual roles mattered. Faith created alternative hierarchies in a rigidly stratified society. By late afternoon and early evening, religious activity intensified. Small processions moved through streets. Incense burned at doorways. Lamps were lit before household shrines. These acts were not spectacular, but constant. They punctuated daily life, offering reassurance against unpredictability. Yet Ostia's religious landscape was not static. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, new currents flowed through the city. Christianity arrived not as a sudden rupture, but as another voice in an already crowded spiritual marketplace. Early Christian communities in Ostia met quietly, often in private homes. They drew followers among the poor, the enslaved, and those marginalized by traditional structures, but also among merchants and administrators seeking moral clarity in a complex world. Christianity offered something distinct, not simply another god, but a different relationship to community and time. Where other cults focused on protection and prosperity in the present, Christianity emphasized salvation beyond it. Where Ostia's religious life had been plural, Christianity's claim to exclusivity introduced tension. But even this transition was gradual. Archaeological evidence suggests coexistence rather than immediate conflict. Shrines remained in use. Cults adapted. Christianity spread not by erasing Ostia's diversity, but by inhabiting it. This slow transformation mirrors the city's broader history. Ostia rarely experienced abrupt change. It absorbed shifts quietly, adjusting its rhythms rather than abandoning them. Religion, like commerce, was a tool for managing uncertainty. When storms delayed ships, offerings increased. When disease spread, prayers multiplied. When prosperity returned, festivals followed. Faith tracked fortune closely, and yet belief also shaped identity. In a city where few people were truly from Ostia, religion offered a sense of place. To belong to a cult was to belong somewhere, even temporarily. It provided meaning beyond contracts and cargo. As the day drew toward night, the lamps before shrines burned steadily. The city settled into quieter patterns. Prayers were spoken not loudly, but persistently. These were not prayers for empire. They were prayers for survival. Standing in Ostia Antica today, surrounded by these modest, sacred spaces, one realizes something crucial. Rome's power was sustained not only by legions and law, but by belief systems flexible enough to hold a fragmented world together. Ostia did not need uniform faith. It needed shared reassurance, and that reassurance came not from a single god, but from many, each reflecting the hopes, fears, and identities of the people who passed through this city by the sea. As darkness deepened, the shrines glowed faintly. The city slept, not in certainty, but in trust that morning would come again, and with it another cycle of labor, negotiation, and adaptation. Religion did not remove risk from Ostia, it made risk livable. To call Ostia a Roman city is accurate but incomplete. Rome built it, administered it, taxed it, and depended on it. Yet Ostia was never culturally homogeneous. It was Roman in law and infrastructure, but cosmopolitan in practice. Its streets echoed with accents from across the Mediterranean. Its households blended customs. Its population was constantly in motion. Ostia was Rome's threshold city, and threshold cities are always different. Foreigners were not a minority here. They were the norm. Merchants from Alexandria, sailors from the Aegean, traders from North Africa, administrators from Italy's interior, all arrived with their languages, habits, and expectations. Some stayed briefly, others settled permanently. Many formed families that blurred distinctions between Roman and non-Roman within a single generation. This diversity was not accidental. Rome needed Ostia to be open. Trade demanded trust across cultures. Contracts had to be enforceable regardless of origin. The city's success depended on its ability to absorb outsiders without constant friction. Roman law provided the framework. Citizenship mattered, but it was not the only form of belonging. Legal statuses were layered and flexible. Freedmen, formerly enslaved individuals who had been manumitted, occupied a particularly important place in Ostia's society. Freedmen were everywhere. They ran businesses, managed warehouses, oversaw workshops, served as intermediaries between elite owners and labor forces. Many guild inscriptions in Ostia list freedmen prominently, sometimes as leaders or patrons. Why here? Because Ostia rewarded competence more than pedigree. Freedmen often possessed experience, networks, and ambition. They understood trade because they had lived within it. In a city defined by logistics, these qualities mattered more than ancestry. This did not mean equality. Freedmen carried social stigma. Legal restrictions remained. Elite Romans often viewed them with suspicion. But in Ostia, where work could not pause for prejudice, freedmen found space to maneuver. The built environment reflects this. Modest but well-appointed houses belonging to freedmen line Ostia's streets. Inscriptions proudly record names, professions, and affiliations. These were statements of arrival, claims to legitimacy carved in stone. Foreigners, too, left their mark. Graffiti in multiple languages appears throughout the city. Religious dedications reference distant homelands. Burial inscriptions preserve names that do not conform to Roman norms. Ostia did not erase difference, it displayed it. This openness came with tension. Competition was fierce, trade was volatile, economic downturns hit migrants hardest. Legal disputes often favored citizens over non-citizens. Violence was not unknown. Ostia's diversity required constant negotiation. But the city developed mechanisms to manage this. Guilds provided protection and advocacy. Religious associations offered community. Informal networks, shared origin, shared language, shared trade, created trust where law alone could not. Children born in Ostia embodied this synthesis. They grew up Roman in habit, if not always in ancestry. They spoke Latin fluently. They navigated Roman institutions. Over time, distinctions blurred. Roman identity expanded, incorporating new blood, new customs, new gods. This process was not ideological. It was practical. Rome did not assimilate because it believed in diversity. It assimilated because it needed functionality. Ostia was a laboratory for that necessity. Walking through the ruins today, this layered identity becomes visible. A bakery run by a freedman sits beside a shrine to an Eastern deity. A Latin inscription commemorates a Greek-named merchant. An apartment block houses families whose origins span continents. This is Rome beyond marble ideals. This is Rome as system. By evening, when the city gathered for entertainment or worship, these differences did not vanish, but they coexisted. People sat side by side in the theater. They shared baths. They drank in the same taverns. Ostia forced interaction, and interaction reshaped identity. Over generations, what it meant to be Roman changed. Citizenship expanded. Cultural practices merged. Ostia did not resist this change. It facilitated it. This is one of the city's most important lessons. Empires endure not because they impose uniformity, but because they manage diversity effectively, at least for a time. Yet Ostia's success lay not in harmony, but in accommodation. Yet this accommodation had limits. Economic stress, political instability, and shifting trade routes strained Ostia's social fabric. As the city's importance declined, competition intensified. Those with fewer resources suffered first. Migrants moved on. Freedmen lost opportunities. Social mobility narrowed. Decline exposed fault lines that prosperity had masked. Still, Ostia's long life testifies to the effectiveness of its model. For centuries, it absorbed waves of newcomers, integrated them into its rhythms, and functioned as Rome's indispensable partner. To understand Ostia is to understand Rome not as a closed civilization, but as an adaptive one, capable of expanding its identity to meet its needs. As night settled again over the city, voices in many accents drifted through the streets. Lamps illuminated doorways where families gathered, each with different histories, sharing the same uncertain future. Tomorrow would bring new arrivals, and Ostia would adjust. Every great Roman city depended on water, not symbolically, not ceremonially, but relentlessly, in quantities that shaped daily survival. Ostia Antica, despite its proximity to the Tiber and the sea, was no exception. In fact, water defined Ostia's limits as much as its possibilities. To understand a day in Ostia fully, one must look beneath the streets. The city's visible life, commerce, religion, entertainment, domestic routine, rested on a dense web of infrastructure that was rarely celebrated and never optional. Water had to arrive clean. Waste had to leave efficiently. Failure in either direction meant disease, unrest, and decline. Ostia's aqueducts fed the city continuously, bringing fresh water from inland sources safer than the brackish Tiber. From these aqueducts, water flowed into public fountains, baths, and latrines, then onward into drains and sewers that carried waste away. This system was impressive, but imperfect. Public fountains were the lifeblood of daily routine. People gathered here throughout the day, filling containers, washing hands, exchanging news. The fountain was a social node as much as a utility. It was also a reminder of inequality. Those who lived closest had easier access. Those farther away waited longer, carried more. Water was heavy. For households without direct access, daily life included hauling it upstairs, often multiple times a day. Children, enslaved people, and the poor bore much of this burden. The architecture of Ostia, its narrow stairwells and steep climbs, turns water into labor. Baths consumed enormous quantities. To operate even a modest bath complex required constant flow, heating, and drainage. Fires burned beneath floors. Water circulated through heated and unheated chambers. Waste exited through dedicated channels. Baths were marvels of engineering, but they were also fragile systems. Disruptions were frequent. When water pressure dropped or fuel ran short, baths closed. Complaints followed quickly. Sanitation posed even greater challenges. Ostia's public latrines were communal, functional, and often unsettling to modern eyes. Stone benches lined walls. Open channels of flowing water beneath carried waste away. There was no privacy. No flushing mechanism as we understand it, only continuous flow. Access was not universal. Many residents relied on chamber pots emptied into drains, cesspits, or streets. Despite regulations, enforcement was uneven. The smell of waste was part of the city's sensory landscape. So were flies, so were rodents. Disease thrived in such conditions. Intestinal parasites were common. Respiratory illnesses spread quickly in crowded housing. Flooding exacerbated everything, backing up drains and contaminating water sources. Medical knowledge existed, but prevention was limited by infrastructure and understanding. Yet Ostia endured, because the city's systems, though imperfect, were better than alternatives available elsewhere in the ancient world. Roman engineering did not eliminate disease, it reduced catastrophe. The sewers beneath Ostia, though less monumental than Rome's Cloaca Maxima, still channeled waste away from living spaces. Streets were cambered to encourage runoff. Drainage channels intersected carefully. These were not accidents. They were the product of accumulated experience, lessons learned through failure, codified through practice. Ostia's builders understood that water management was not glamorous, but existential. Flooding was the city's recurring nightmare. The Tiber did not respect urban planning. Seasonal swells pushed water into low-lying districts. Ground floors flooded. Warehouses were threatened. Streets turned to mud. Adaptation followed. Raised thresholds appear throughout Ostia's buildings, silent evidence of repeated inundation. Drainage systems were modified. Lower floors were repurposed or abandoned. Residents learned to live vertically. This relationship with water-shaped behavior. People planned around floods. They stored valuables higher. They avoided certain streets during rainy seasons. Memory, not optimism, guided survival. Water also shaped religion. Shrines near fountains honored nymphs and river gods. Offerings were made to ensure steady flow and protection from excess. The line between engineering and belief blurred where control ended. A day in Ostia thus involved constant negotiation with invisible forces. You drank knowing contamination was possible. You bathed knowing illness might follow. You lived with waste nearby because removing it completely was impossible. Survival depended not on purity but on balance. Modern visitors often romanticize Roman infrastructure. Ostia complicates that narrative. The city was advanced but not clean, efficient but not safe by modern standards. Its systems worked just well enough to sustain density, and no better. This margin mattered. As Ostia's economic importance declined, maintenance suffered. Aqueducts were repaired less often, drains clogged, flooding worsened, public baths closed. Sanitation deteriorated, infrastructure decay mirrored social decline. Without constant care, even the best systems fail. Ostia did not collapse because Romans forgot how to build. It declined because the incentives to maintain no longer justified the cost. This is perhaps the city's most enduring lesson. Civilization is not preserved by innovation alone, it is preserved by maintenance. Standing today above Ostia's buried drains and channels, one realizes how much of history lies out of sight. Great narratives focus on emperors and battles. Cities survive or fail because water flows, or does not. Every morning in Ostia depended on clean supply. Every afternoon relied on waste removal. Every evening assumed systems would hold through the night. For centuries they did, until they didn't. And when they faltered, the city's ability to support dense life faltered with them. A day in Ostia, then, is not only a human story, it is an infrastructural one, and it reminds us that the most important achievements of the past are often the least visible. If Ostia's streets and systems sustained Rome, it was human labor that made those systems move. Nothing in Ostia functioned without work, not the docks, not the warehouses, not the baths, the bakeries, the apartments, or the shrines. The city's extraordinary logistical efficiency rested on bodies, some free, some constrained, many exhausted. To understand a day in Ostia honestly, one must confront this reality directly. Work began early and ended late. Dock workers rose before sunrise. Warehouse laborers moved heavy loads all day. Bakers worked through the night so bread would be ready by morning. Maintenance crews repaired streets, drains, and roofs constantly. Bath attendants tended fires without pause. Shopkeepers stood for hours. Sailors slept irregularly, governed by tides rather than clocks. The city did not slow for comfort. And at the foundation of this relentless motion stood slavery. Slavery in Ostia was not peripheral, it was structural. Enslaved people unloaded ships, carried water, cleaned latrines, cooked meals, managed accounts, educated children, repaired buildings, and sometimes supervised other workers. They lived everywhere, in apartments, workshops, warehouses, elite homes. They were visible, audible, indispensable. Roman slavery was not racially defined, but it was absolute. Enslaved individuals were property under law. They could be bought, sold, punished, or separated from family at their owner's discretion. In a city as economically intense as Ostia, this vulnerability was magnified. And yet, slavery in Ostia was also complex. Many enslaved workers held specialized skills. Some managed entire operations. Others handled finances, logistics, or education. Their value depended not only on physical strength, but on expertise. This created paradoxes. An enslaved accountant might control immense resources but possess no legal autonomy. A freedman, formerly enslaved, might later own property and employ others. Status could change over a lifetime, but the system itself remained intact. Manumission was common in Ostia. Owners freed enslaved individuals for loyalty, service, or economic advantage. Freedmen often remained tied to former masters through patronage relationships, continuing to work within the same networks. This fluidity helped Ostia function. It allowed the city to retain experienced labor while offering limited social mobility. It encouraged investment in skills. It blurred boundaries just enough to sustain cooperation. But it did not erase exploitation. Free laborers also faced harsh conditions. Porters, construction workers, and artisans worked long hours for modest pay. Employment was often seasonal and uncertain. Injuries could end livelihoods abruptly. There was no safety net beyond family, guild, or religious association. Women labored constantly as well. They worked in households, shops, textile production, food preparation, and service industries. Some ran businesses, others labored invisibly within domestic spaces. Their work was essential and under-recorded. Children contributed early. They fetched water, assisted in workshops, carried messages, and learned trades through participation. Childhood in Ostia was brief. Economic necessity pressed early. This concentration of labor shaped the city's social atmosphere. Ostia was not leisurely, it was intense. People moved with purpose. Rest was functional, not indulgent. Even leisure, baths, taverns, theater, served recovery rather than escape. The cost of this intensity was visible. Skeletal remains from Ostia show signs of repetitive strain, malnutrition, and disease. Bodies bore the marks of labor. Life expectancy was limited. Survival required resilience more than comfort. Yet the city persisted, because Rome demanded it. The capital's appetite was insatiable: grain for bread, oil for light and food, wine for consumption, materials for construction, goods for status. Ostia absorbed this demand and translated it into work. Empire did not operate abstractly, it operated through calloused hands. This reality complicates romantic visions of Roman civilization. Ostia was advanced, organized, impressive, but it was also exploitative, exhausting, and unequal. The ruins do not hide this truth. Wear marks on stairs reveal constant use. Repairs layered atop repairs suggest relentless stress. Inscriptions honor guild leaders, not laborers. Silence fills the gaps where ordinary voices went unrecorded. And yet labor also created community. Shared work forged bonds. Guilds protected members. Religious associations offered solidarity. Families relied on mutual effort. Even within oppression, people formed lives, relationships, and identities. This duality is essential. Ostia was neither a paradise nor a dystopia. It was a working city. As evening approached and labor slowed, bodies carried fatigue into homes and taverns. Muscles ached, injuries throbbed. Tomorrow's work loomed already. Yet lamps were lit, food was shared, laughter emerged despite exhaustion. Life continued not because it was easy, but because it had to. Ostia reminds us that empire was not sustained by ideals alone. It was sustained by work, constant, demanding, human. And that work left traces everywhere, in brick and bone, in systems and scars. To walk Ostia Antica is to walk through the residue of effort, layered day after day, generation after generation. Rome's power passed through this city. Its cost did too. In Ostia, childhood unfolded in public. There were no quiet suburban streets, no private gardens set apart from the noise of labor. Children grew up amid the sounds of carts, the shouts of dock workers, the hiss of bathhouse steam, the clang of tools, and the murmur of many languages. From their earliest days, they absorbed the city's rhythms not as lessons, but as atmosphere. A day in Ostia belonged to adults, but children moved through it constantly. They ran errands through crowded streets. They carried water from fountains. They helped in shops and workshops. They watched ships unload and learned the names of distant places long before they could read them. The city itself was their classroom. Formal education existed, but unevenly. Some families could afford to send children, usually boys, sometimes girls, to a ludus, a primary school run by a local teacher. These schools were modest spaces, a rented room, a shaded portico, sometimes simply a corner of a public building. Instruction focused on reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, taught through repetition and memorization. Lessons began early. Children traced letters in wax tablets, recited aloud, and learned to calculate sums essential for trade. Discipline was strict. Roman education valued endurance as much as intellect. The goal was not creativity, but competence. For wealthier families, education extended further. Grammar schools taught literature, rhetoric, and history, skills necessary for administration and public life. These children learned to read canonical texts, to speak persuasively, and to understand Roman values embedded in stories of ancestors and heroes. But Ostia was not Rome. Most children did not progress far beyond basic literacy. Their education was practical, shaped by the city's needs. Apprenticeship mattered more than eloquence. Skills passed from parent to child, master to apprentice, through observation and repetition. A baker's child learned dough before declension. A dock worker's child learned balance, strength, and coordination early. Children were not sheltered from work. They were integrated into it. This integration had costs. Physical labor took a toll on growing bodies. Accidents were common. Education ended early for many. Opportunities narrowed quickly along lines of wealth and status. Yet this early immersion also created competence. By adolescence, many Ostian youths were already skilled workers. They understood schedules, contracts, and routines. They were ready to assume adult roles quickly, a necessity in a city where survival depended on contribution. Identity formation followed similar patterns. Children learned what it meant to be Roman not through abstract instruction, but through participation. They watched legal disputes unfold in the forum. They observed religious rituals at shrines. They heard political news in baths and taverns. Roman values, duty, hierarchy, pragmatism were absorbed through daily exposure. Citizenship, when attained, carried meaning because it came with lived responsibility. Even those without full legal status understood the system intimately. Girls' education differed, but it was no less significant. Many girls learned household management, textile production, and commercial skills. Some were literate. In Ostia's economic environment, women's labor was indispensable. They ran shops, managed property, and participated actively in religious life. Childhood ended early for everyone. Marriage came young. Work intensified. Expectations hardened, yet children also played. Game boards, scratched into stone, still appear on steps and thresholds. Dice, knucklebones, and toys have been found in excavations. These small artifacts remind us that joy persisted alongside responsibility. Children found moments of lightness within constraint. As evening approached, families gathered again. Children listened to stories, some educational, some entertaining, many moralizing. Tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors reinforced identity. Stories taught caution, loyalty, and ambition in equal measure. These narratives mattered. They connected personal lives to larger frameworks. They explained why the city functioned as it did. They justified inequality and endurance alike. Over time, these children became Ostia's adults. They inherited not only skills, but expectations. They understood the city's fragility. They knew that their prosperity depended on forces beyond their control. They learned adaptability early. This adaptability was Rome's quiet strength. Ostia did not produce philosophers in abundance. It produced competent citizens, people able to function within complex systems, adjust to change, and maintain continuity. As Ostia declined, children felt it first. Schools closed, apprenticeships disappeared, families moved away. Childhood opportunities narrowed. the city's future contracted, but for centuries Ostia raised generations capable of sustaining Rome's demands. That achievement deserves attention, because empires do not endure through ideology alone. They endure through education, formal and informal, that reproduces functional behavior. Ostia's children were not taught to rule, they were taught to sustain, and in doing so they held up an empire. Health in Ostia was never assumed. It was negotiated daily through habit, luck, experience, and belief, within a city whose density, labor demands, and environmental exposure made illness an expected companion of life rather than an exception to it. A day in Ostia unfolded with bodies already marked by risk. From the moment residents woke, they confronted hazards embedded in routine. Water might be contaminated, food might spoil, streets might conceal waste, crowded rooms might circulate disease invisibly, work might injure suddenly and irreversibly. Yet Ostia did not respond to these dangers with paralysis. It responded with adaptation. Roman medicine in Ostia was practical, eclectic, and unevenly accessible. Physicians practiced throughout the city, some formally trained, others self-taught. Their methods blended observation, inherited theory, folk remedies, and religious practice. Medical texts circulated, especially among educated elites, drawing on Greek traditions that emphasized balance, of humors, of diet, of environment. Illness was often understood not as invasion, but as imbalance, a disruption of harmony between body and surroundings. This perspective shaped treatment. Diet was central. Certain foods were believed to cool or warm the body, to dry or moisten it. Rest and exercise were prescribed carefully. Baths were considered therapeutic, though they also carried risk. Massage, oils, and herbal preparations were common. Surgery existed, but it was limited. Tools found in Ostia suggest procedures for treating wounds, setting bones, draining abscesses. Pain management was rudimentary. Survival depended on the body's resilience as much as the practitioner's skill. Access to care followed social lines. Wealthier households could afford regular consultation. They could isolate the sick, control diet, and seek multiple opinions. Poorer residents relied on communal knowledge, religious healing, or improvised care. Slaves' health was a matter of investment. Owners treated valuable enslaved workers to preserve productivity. Others received minimal attention. Illness could mean replacement rather than recovery. Disease spread easily. Crowded insulae amplified respiratory infections. Parasites thrived. Childhood illnesses were common and often fatal. Epidemics periodically swept through the city, leaving fear and disruption in their wake. Ostia's port amplified vulnerability. Ships brought not only goods, but pathogens. Sailors arrived from distant regions carrying unfamiliar illnesses. Quarantine was poorly understood. Exposure was inevitable. Yet Ostia did not retreat from the world. It could not. The city existed precisely because it was open. Closing itself would have meant starvation elsewhere. This tension between exposure and necessity defined Ostia's health landscape. Religious healing played a crucial role. Shrines dedicated to healing deities dotted the city. Offerings of body parts made of clay, legs, eyes, hands, have been found, symbolizing requests for cure. Prayer complemented medicine rather than opposing it. For many, healing was a communal act. Families gathered around the ill, neighbors assisted, religious associations provided support. Care was social as much as medical. Death, when it came, was integrated into routine. Funerals moved through the streets regularly. Burial grounds outside the city gates expanded steadily. Inscriptions recorded grief, hope, resignation. The dead were remembered briefly. Then life continued. This constant proximity to mortality shaped psychology. Ostians were not fatalistic, but they were realistic. They understood that control was limited. Preparation mattered more than certainty. Resilience mattered more than prevention. This realism informed daily choices. People avoided certain foods in certain seasons. They rested when possible. They sought divine favor. They accepted loss without surrendering function. The city's medical culture was not about eliminating risk. It was about managing it. This mindset extended beyond health. It shaped attitudes toward work, family, and belief. Ostians lived with uncertainty, not because they lacked alternatives, but because uncertainty was intrinsic to their environment. A day in Ostia involved constant calibration: when to work harder, when to rest, when to seek help, when to endure quietly. Modern observers often judge ancient medicine by its limitations. Ostia invites a different perspective. Given the constraints of knowledge, infrastructure, and technology, the city's inhabitants displayed remarkable adaptability. They developed systems, social, religious, practical, that allowed life to continue amid persistent threat. This adaptability did not eliminate suffering, but it prevented collapse. As evening approached again, households assessed health quietly. Coughs were noted, wounds cleaned, lamps lit carefully to avoid fire. The night carried its own dangers, and yet people slept, because tomorrow would demand it. Health in Ostia was not a state, it was a process. One managed hour by hour, day by day, generation by generation, and in that process the city endured far longer than its founders could have imagined. Order in Ostia was not imposed from afar. It was negotiated daily through habit, visibility, reputation, and a legal culture that prioritized continuity over spectacle. Unlike Rome, where law could feel theatrical and imperial, Ostia's justice was intimate, immediate, and deeply practical. A day in Ostia unfolded under constant regulation. Weights and measures were standardized, contracts were witnessed, property boundaries were marked, water usage was governed, markets were inspected, streets were maintained according to ordinance. None of this was glamorous, but all of it was essential. Law here existed to prevent disruption. The city could not afford prolonged conflict. Too much depended on cooperation. Trade schedules, supply chains, labor coordination. Justice was therefore designed to be visible and swift rather than dramatic. The Forum was the center of this system. Magistrates presided in public view. Disputes were aired openly. Accusations were heard by neighbors who knew the parties involved. Reputation mattered enormously. A merchant known for dishonesty found contracts harder to secure. A landlord known for negligence faced complaints quickly. This social visibility reduced some forms of crime. Petty theft occurred, but large-scale fraud was risky. Arson was rare and harshly punished. Violence threatened stability and was treated seriously. Yet Ostia was not crime-free. Crowded housing bred conflict. Alcohol fueled disputes. Economic stress heightened tension. Assaults occurred. Property damage happened. Enslaved individuals resisted mistreatment in subtle ways, slowing work, breaking tools, fleeing when possible. The legal system addressed these issues unevenly. Citizens enjoyed greater protections. Freedmen occupied an ambiguous space. Enslaved individuals had little recourse. Punishments varied by status as much as by offense. This inequality was structural. Roman law was explicit about hierarchy. Justice did not mean equality before the law. It meant predictability within rank. And predictability mattered. People knew what consequences to expect. That knowledge shaped behavior. The system's legitimacy rested not on fairness, but on consistency. Municipal officials, duoviri, aediles, and other magistrates handled most local matters. They were responsible for maintaining order, supervising markets, organizing public works, and enforcing regulations. Their authority was limited, but immediate. Their success depended on cooperation. Magistrates were drawn from local elites. They lived among the people they governed. Abuse of power was visible and risky. While corruption existed, it was constrained by proximity. This closeness made law personal. Disputes were rarely abstract. They involved neighbors, colleagues, rivals. Legal proceedings doubled as social negotiation. Settlements were often preferred to prolonged litigation. Guilds played a crucial role here. They mediated disputes among members, enforced standards, and represented collective interests. Internal discipline reduced the burden on formal courts. Guild membership offered protection, but also accountability. Religious associations functioned similarly. They resolved conflicts quietly. They provided arbitration. They reinforced norms through shared belief rather than force. Punishment in Ostia was utilitarian. Fines were common. Confiscation occurred. Public shaming was effective. If physical punishment existed, especially for enslaved individuals, but execution was rare in daily urban life. The goal was correction, not terror. This approach contributed to stability. A city dependent on constant movement could not afford fear-driven paralysis. Order had to be maintained without undermining productivity. Night brought additional challenges. Darkness increased risk. Patrols existed, though limited. Residents relied on community vigilance. Lamps illuminated key streets. Taverns were monitored. Fires were the greatest threat, accidental or deliberate. Fire regulations were strict. Building materials were regulated. Storage practices were monitored. Rapid response was essential. Firefighting was communal. Bucket chains, quick demolition, collective action. Legal accountability followed fires. Negligence was punished. Responsibility was assigned. The system discouraged carelessness through consequence. Law in Ostia was not abstract justice, it was operational discipline, and this discipline extended to the margins. Burial practices were regulated. Religious processions required approval. Public gatherings were monitored. The city managed not only behavior, but rhythm. This management shaped identity. To live in Ostia was to internalize its rules. People learned where they could act freely and where restraint was expected. They navigated authority not as an external force, but as part of daily life. This internalization reduced resistance. The city did not need constant enforcement because most residents understood the cost of disorder. As Ostia declined, this system weakened. Officials lost authority. Maintenance lapsed. Disputes increased. Informal resolution replaced formal process. Stability eroded not through rebellion, but through neglect. Law, like infrastructure, requires maintenance. Without purpose, it decays. Ostia's ruins preserve inscriptions of laws, dedications by magistrates, records of civic pride. They testify to a city that valued order, not as ideology, but as necessity. A day in Ostia depended on justice functioning quietly in the background. When it did, the city thrived. When it faltered, the city faded. Rome's empire did not rest solely on legions. It rested on cities like Ostia, where law worked because people needed it to. Money moved through Ostia constantly, not in the abstract way we imagine imperial wealth, but in small, relentless exchanges that determined whether people ate, rested, repaired, or endured another day. Ostia's markets were not places of spectacle. They were mechanisms of survival, finely tuned to the rhythms of supply and demand that pulsed through the empire. A day in Ostia was measured in transactions. At dawn, dock workers were paid or promised payment. Contracts were renegotiated as ships arrived late or early. Prices shifted subtly depending on rumor, weather, and political news carried upriver from Rome. No one needed to announce scarcity for it to be felt. People sensed it in smaller loaves of bread, in watered wine, in delayed shipments. Currency in Ostia was ubiquitous but uneven. Coins of bronze, silver, and occasionally gold circulated constantly. Wages were often paid daily or weekly, especially for laborers whose work was seasonal or unpredictable. This created precarity. But missed work meant missed meals. Markets formed the city's economic nervous system. Some were permanent structures, others emerged informally at street corners and open spaces. Vendors sold grain, vegetables, fish, oil, cloth, tools, and prepared food. Prices were regulated, but enforcement varied. Inflation was a recurring anxiety, especially during periods of political instability. The state intervened selectively. Bread distribution, the annona, was a cornerstone of imperial policy. Ostia played a crucial role in this system, storing and forwarding grain destined for Rome. When supply faltered, unrest followed quickly. But Ostia's residents were not the primary beneficiaries of state largesse. They lived near abundance without owning it. Grain passed through their city, guarded and regulated, while many struggled to afford daily food. This proximity to wealth without access sharpened economic awareness. People knew exactly what was at stake when shipments were delayed or diverted. Markets reflected hierarchy. Elite buyers negotiated privately. Merchants leveraged connections. Ordinary residents paid posted prices or accepted what was available. Credit existed, but it carried risk. Debt could spiral quickly, especially after illness or injury. Women played a central role in market life. They bought food, sold goods, managed household finances. Some ran stalls or shops. Their economic activity was visible and constant, even if rarely recorded formally. Children, too, participated. They ran errands, assisted vendors, learned pricing and negotiation by observation. Economic literacy was learned early because it was essential. Money also shaped social relationships. Gifts reinforced patronage. Loans created obligation. Payment delays strained trust. Ostia's dense social fabric amplified economic interactions. Reputations traveled fast. This visibility constrained exploitation to a degree. A dishonest merchant risked exclusion. A reliable one gained loyalty. Economic behavior became social capital. Yet inequality remained stark. Enslaved individuals generated wealth they could not retain. Freedmen accumulated assets but remained vulnerable. The poor lived close to the edge, one disruption away from crisis. Economic shocks were common. Storms delayed ships. Wars disrupted trade routes. Political transitions altered policy. Each shock rippled outward through Ostia's markets, compressing margins and magnifying hardship. People adapted. They diversified income. They joined associations. They relied on family networks. They adjusted consumption, substituting cheaper foods, reducing portions, delaying repairs. These strategies were not signs of failure. They were survival skills. Ostia's economy was resilient precisely because it was flexible. It could absorb shocks without collapsing immediately. But resilience had limits. As the empire strained in later centuries, monetary stability deteriorated. Coinage was debased. Prices rose. Trust eroded. Markets became volatile. Ostia felt this early. Its dependence on long-distance trade made it sensitive to imperial weakness. As Rome's demand fluctuated, Ostia's markets oscillated between boom and contraction. The city's decline followed economic logic. When trade shifted elsewhere, money followed. Maintenance became unaffordable, labor migrated, markets shrank, economic life narrowed. Yet even in decline, exchange persisted. People continued to buy, sell, barter. Life did not end abruptly, it contracted. Money reveals this truth clearly. Empires do not disappear when coins stop circulating. They disappear when those coins no longer sustain daily life. Ostia's ruins preserve shops, counters, scales, and coin hoards. These artifacts testify not to imperial grandeur, but to calculation, to countless decisions made under pressure. A day in Ostia was shaped by money not as abstraction, but as constraint. What could be bought today? What must wait? What could be risked? And what could not? In that calculus, Ostia lived. Ostia did not fall. It emptied. This distinction matters because it reshapes how we understand both the city and the Roman world that depended on it. There was no single catastrophe to mark Ostia's end, no sack, no earthquake, no sudden obliteration. Instead, there was a gradual withdrawal of purpose, so slow that those living through it may not have recognized it as decline at all. A day in Ostia, in its later centuries, looked much like it always had, just quieter. Ships still arrived, but fewer of them. Warehouses still opened, but not all at once. Markets still functioned, but stalls closed earlier. Streets remained navigable, but foot traffic thinned. Life continued, but its density decreased. The reasons were structural. The Tiber continued to deposit silt, pushing the coastline farther outward. The harbor that had once made Ostia indispensable became increasingly difficult to use. Larger ships struggled to dock. Maintenance costs rose. The empire responded pragmatically by developing Portus, a new harbor complex closer to the open sea. This decision did not condemn Ostia immediately. At first, Ostia adapted. It remained connected to Portus through roads and canals. Some functions shifted, others persisted. Residents adjusted, as they always had. But over time, gravity asserted itself. Trade followed efficiency. Merchants relocated. Guilds moved their headquarters. Administrative attention drifted. The economic engine that had powered Ostia slowed incrementally. With reduced revenue came reduced maintenance. Public buildings were repaired less frequently. Baths closed sections. Fountains ran intermittently. Streets deteriorated. These changes were subtle, but cumulative. Social life contracted accordingly. As opportunities dwindled, families moved away, often gradually taking advantage of connections elsewhere. Migrants stopped arriving. Children grew up with fewer prospects. The city's demographic profile aged. This demographic shift mattered. Younger populations sustain renewal. Older populations conserve. Ostia entered a phase of preservation rather than expansion. Religious life reflected this change. Some shrines fell out of use. Others persisted stubbornly. Christianity gained prominence, but it did not revive the city's economic purpose. Faith could offer meaning, but it could not replace trade. By the 5th century CE, Ostia was no longer essential. Rome itself was changing. Political authority fragmented, imperial systems strained. The Annona faltered. The capital's population declined. Demand dropped. Ostia's fate was tied to Rome's. As Rome's needs diminished, so did Ostia's reason for being. And yet, people remained. The city did not become a ghost town overnight. Communities persisted within shrinking boundaries. Buildings were repurposed. Materials were reused. Life adapted downward. This adaptability delayed abandonment, but it also ensured preservation. Without dramatic destruction, Ostia's structures were not systematically dismantled. They collapsed slowly, floor by floor, sealed by debris rather than fire. Nature reclaimed space gently, grass, shrubs, pine trees. Time became protective. By the early medieval period, Ostia had become peripheral, remembered but rarely visited. Its name survived in documents, but its streets lay silent. The city that once fed Rome now fed memory. This kind of decline challenges modern expectations. We often imagine civilizations ending violently. Ostia suggests something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. Relevance can vanish without catastrophe. Purpose can dissolve. Cities can outlive their reason for existence. Ostia's silence was not imposed, it emerged, and that emergence preserved it. When archaeologists began uncovering Ostia in the modern era, they encountered not rubble, but rooms, not fragments, but systems. The city had not been erased, it had been paused. This pause allows us something rare. We can walk through a Roman city not frozen by disaster, but shaped by routine. We can see how decline unfolds when no one is watching for it. A day in Ostia at its end would have felt familiar to its inhabitants. They would have recognized the streets, the rituals, the rhythms. What they may not have recognized was how diminished their world had become relative to its past. Decline, when gradual, disguises itself as continuity. This is Ostia's most haunting lesson. Not that empires fall suddenly, but that they fade quietly, through a series of reasonable decisions responding to immediate pressures. No one intended to abandon Ostia. They simply stopped needing it, and in that absence of need, the city slipped into silence. Ostia did not announce its return to history. It surfaced slowly, reluctantly, through soil and vegetation, its outlines emerging not as revelation, but as accumulation. Long after emperors, popes, and kings had reshaped Rome again and again, Ostia lay quietly beyond attention, too far from power, too close to marshland, too ordinary to inspire legend. Its rediscovery was not driven by romance, it was driven by patience. Early travelers to the area in the Renaissance noticed ruins, but they saw them through the lens of classical admiration, columns, inscriptions, fragments worthy of collection. What lay beneath the ground, however, was not immediately apparent. Ostia was not a city of isolated monuments. It was a city of layers. Serious excavation began in the 19th century, intensifying under Italian state-sponsored archaeology in the early 20th century. What archaeologists encountered challenged expectations shaped by Rome and Pompeii alike. They did not uncover villas first, they uncovered streets. Block after block emerged with astonishing coherence. Apartment buildings stood several stories high. Shops opened onto sidewalks. Courtyards revealed drainage systems intact. Latrines, baths, bakeries, warehouses, entire functional units appeared together. This was not a city curated for memory. It was a city preserved by neglect. Unlike Rome, which was continuously built over, Ostia had been abandoned early enough to escape medieval redevelopment. Unlike Pompeii, which froze a moment in catastrophe, Ostia preserved processes: repair, reuse, adaptation, decline. For archaeologists, this posed both opportunity and challenge. The temptation was to seek spectacle. Instead, Ostia demanded attention to detail. Brick stamps, graffiti, wear patterns on stairs, alterations to doorways, these became the primary sources. Ostia's value lay not in what was grand, but in what was repeated. Excavation strategies reflected this shift. Rather than isolating monuments, archaeologists exposed neighborhoods. They traced how buildings changed over centuries, how ground floors were converted from shops to apartments, how courtyards were roofed. how staircases were reinforced. Each modification told a story of adjustment. The city became a laboratory for understanding Roman urban life beyond elite ideals. It revealed how ordinary people adapted to economic pressure, environmental change, and shifting political realities. Artifacts recovered from Ostia reinforced this perspective. Pottery fragments revealed dietary habits. Tools showed wear consistent with long use. Coins clustered in ways that suggested everyday loss rather than hoarding. Children's toys appeared alongside work implements. This was not a city remembered through literature. It was remembered through residue. Inscriptions provided voices, but not the voices historians were accustomed to hearing. They recorded guild memberships, dedications by freedmen, memorials to family members. Ostia's epigraphy skewed toward the middle of society, people important enough to inscribe, but not important enough to be written about elsewhere. This skew was invaluable. It allowed historians to reconstruct social dynamics normally invisible in elite texts. We see women identified as business owners, freedmen as patrons, migrants asserting belonging. These inscriptions challenge simplified models of Roman society. Archaeology also exposed limits. Ostia's preservation can create illusion. What survives is not what was most common, but what endured structurally. Upper floors collapsed. Wooden elements vanished. Soft materials decayed. Silence fills gaps where sound once dominated. Interpreting Ostia requires restraint. Archaeologists must resist imposing coherence where uncertainty remains. A shop's function may be inferred, not proven. A room's purpose may have shifted over time. Ostia teaches humility in reconstruction. This humility has reshaped Roman studies. Where earlier scholarship focused on law, literature, and elite architecture, Ostia redirected attention toward systems, housing, labor, sanitation, markets. It forced historians to ask how empire worked rather than how it justified itself. In doing so, Ostia altered our understanding of Rome fundamentally. Rome was not sustained by ideals alone. It was sustained by cities like Ostia, where ordinary life was organized efficiently enough to support extraordinary demand. Modern visitors often experience Ostia as unusually real. This reaction is not accidental. The city's scale is human, its spaces feel usable. One can imagine living there, not as an emperor, but as a resident navigating constraints. This imaginative accessibility is Ostia's greatest gift. It collapses distance between past and present without romanticizing it. It allows us to see Roman life not as heroic or alien, but as structured, pressured, and familiar in its challenges. Archaeology, in Ostia's case, is not about recovery alone, it is about recalibration. It recalibrates our assumptions about what mattered in the ancient world. It elevates maintenance over monumentality. It values continuity over drama. In Ostia, the most important discoveries are often the least dramatic. A repaired threshold, a narrowed doorway, a reused brick. These are the marks of life adapting. As excavations continue, Ostia continues to speak, not through spectacle, but through accumulation. Each trench adds nuance. Each artifact complicates narrative. The city resists simplification, and that resistance is its power. Through Ostia, archaeology recovers not a lost golden age, but a functioning one, flawed, unequal, resilient. A day in Ostia, reconstructed through excavation, is not an imagined past. It is an inferred reality, grounded in material evidence, constrained by uncertainty, enriched by context. This is history at its most honest. Rome dominates the imagination. Its ruins rise deliberately. Its monuments declare power. Its history is told through emperors, generals, laws, and spectacles meant to endure. Rome wanted to be seen, remembered, and admired. Ostia did not. And because of that, Ostia tells us things about Rome that Rome itself carefully concealed. To understand the Roman world fully, one must look away from the capital and toward the systems that sustained it. Ostia was not peripheral, it was essential. It reveals Rome not as a timeless ideal, but as a fragile construct dependent on coordination, labor, and compromise. Rome projected permanence. Ostia reveals contingency. In Rome, architecture insists on dominance. Marble forums, triumphal arches, colossal baths. These structures communicate stability, inevitability, and control. They are statements, not conversations. Ostia's architecture, by contrast, is responsive. Buildings adjust. Spaces are repurposed. Shops become apartments. Apartments become workshops. Walls are patched rather than replaced. Infrastructure is modified incrementally. Ostia shows us a Roman city constantly adapting to pressure rather than asserting mastery over it. This adaptability was not weakness, it was survival. Rome's image of itself depended on abstraction, the idea that order flowed outward from the center. Ostia exposes the reverse. Order flowed inward, assembled through countless local decisions made under constraint. Consider food. Rome's grain supply appears in history as policy. The annona, imperial provisioning, administrative triumph. Ostia reveals the reality beneath that abstraction, ships delayed by weather, dock workers laboring under time pressure, warehouses managing spoilage, officials negotiating shortages. Rome could declare abundance. Ostia had to make it real. This distinction matters because it reframes Roman power. Empire was not merely imposed, it was maintained through cooperation among cities that had their own priorities, vulnerabilities, and adaptations. Ostia also complicates Roman social hierarchies. Elite Roman literature emphasizes status, lineage, and moral order. Ostia shows a world where competence often mattered more than pedigree. Freedmen ran businesses, migrants shaped neighborhoods, women exercised economic agency, enslaved individuals managed complex operations. Hierarchy existed, but it was negotiated daily. Rome's ideology insisted on clear divisions. Ostia's reality blurred them constantly. Survival required flexibility that ideology alone could not provide. Religion reveals a similar contrast. Rome promoted civic cults tied to state identity. Ostia practiced pluralism out of necessity. The city's diversity demanded accommodation. Gods coexisted because people did. Religious life adapted to commerce, migration, and risk. Rome could afford uniform symbolism. Ostia could not afford exclusion. Law, too, looks different from the margins. Roman legal theory presents justice as rational and universal. Ostia shows law as situational and pragmatic. Disputes were resolved quickly. Authority was local. Reputation mattered as much as statute. Justice here was not about principle. It was about continuity. Perhaps most importantly, Ostia reveals the cost of Rome's greatness. Rome's monuments obscure labor. Ostia exposes it. Every loaf of bread, every amphora of oil, every public spectacle in the capital depended on invisible effort elsewhere. Ostia was one of those elsewhere. Its people absorbed risk so Rome could project certainty. They lived with uncertainty so Rome could appear stable. Their adaptability masked systemic fragility. This asymmetry shaped imperial memory. Rome remembered itself as eternal. Ostia was forgotten. Yet Ostia endured in material form precisely because it was not constantly reinvented. Rome's continuous occupation destroyed layers even as it celebrated continuity. Ostia's abandonment preserved it. This irony is profound. The city that mattered most to daily imperial function became the clearest window into Roman life because it stopped mattering politically. What Ostia reveals, ultimately, is that empire is not sustained by grandeur alone. It is sustained by maintenance, by cities that function quietly, by people who adapt rather than dominate, by systems that work imperfectly but persist. Rome's history, told only through Rome, becomes distorted. It appears inevitable, coherent, and self-justifying. Ostia disrupts that illusion. It shows empire as contingent, negotiated, and deeply dependent on the ordinary. This does not diminish Rome. It humanizes it, and in doing so, it restores agency to those erased by monumental narratives. A day in Ostia, when fully understood, reveals Rome not as destiny, but as process. A process that worked for centuries because enough people made it work, day after day, under conditions that demanded resilience rather than glory. This is why Ostia Antica matters, not because it was grand, but because it was necessary. The day ends in Ostia as it once did, without ceremony. There is no final trumpet, no closing ritual that announces completion. The light simply softens, shadows stretch across stone, the air cools. What remains is silence, interrupted only by wind moving through pine needles and the distant sound of footsteps on ancient pavement. Walking Ostia Antica today is not like walking through a ruin in the theatrical sense. It is not overwhelming. It does not demand awe. Instead, it invites attention. Here, a worn threshold bears the imprint of countless feet. There, a shop counter still leans toward the street, as if waiting for a customer who will never arrive. An apartment stairwell rises into nothing, its upper floors long gone, its purpose incomplete but legible. This incompleteness is Ostia's final lesson. Civilizations are not finished stories, they are interrupted ones. A day in Ostia, reconstructed across this script, was never exceptional to those who lived it. It was ordinary, it repeated, it was shaped by work, risk, faith, money, family, illness, and uncertainty. And then it happened again and again and again, until gradually it did not. Nothing about Ostia's end feels dramatic because nothing about its life required drama to matter. The city's significance lay in accumulation, of effort, of habit, of adaptation. Standing in Ostia now, one begins to understand that Rome's empire was not sustained by singular moments of greatness, but by the unremarkable persistence of places like this, places that woke early, places that carried weight, places that adjusted when conditions changed. Ostia does not ask to be mourned, it asks to be understood. Modern visitors often speak of the city as alive, and in a sense, it is. Not because people walk its streets again, but because its systems remain intelligible. We can still see how water flowed, how waste was managed, how goods moved, how people gathered, how families lived stacked upon one another. This intelligibility is rare. Most ancient cities survive only as symbols. Ostia survives as process, and that process resonates uncomfortably with the present. Our own cities depend on invisible labor, fragile infrastructure, global supply chains, and maintenance performed quietly by people rarely acknowledged. We, too, live with systems that work just well enough until they do not. We, too, mistake continuity for permanence. Ostia warns without preaching. It shows what happens when purpose shifts, when maintenance declines, when relevance fades, not through catastrophe, but through reasonable decisions made under changing circumstances. No one destroyed Ostia. They simply stopped needing it. And yet, because of that, Ostia remains. It remains as a record of what daily life looked like for the vast majority of people who never appear in imperial histories. It remains as evidence that Rome was not only emperors and legions, but bakers, dock workers, freedmen, children, women, migrants, and enslaved individuals navigating constraints together. To walk Ostia at dusk is to feel time layered rather than lost. The past is not distant here, it is adjacent. You can stand in the forum and imagine voices rising. You can sit in the theater and sense the collective breath of an audience. You can step into an apartment and feel how narrow space shaped intimacy and tension alike. These are not fantasies. They are inferences grounded in stone. As night settles fully, Ostia does what it has done for centuries. It recedes, not into oblivion, but into stillness. And in that stillness, it offers a final, quiet truth that civilization is not measured by what it builds to impress, but by what it builds to function, and whether it is willing to care for those systems long enough to matter. Ostia mattered, not because it was remembered, but because, for a very long time, it worked. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring form of greatness a city can achieve.